And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may happen to be. Um, I'm Tad, I'm here, and I have survived the most proximate holiday, Thanksgiving, and I hope you, those of you who are in these 50 United States, have done the same and have avoided spreading any diseases while you were doing it. And let's see who's here already. Holger, hello, guten Morgen. Ilva, good morning. Chris, hello. Ronnie, yes. Dirk. And let's see, Jeremy, hello. Wouter, good to see you. Cliff, hi Cliff. Yeah, I did have a great Thanksgiving. Very limited, very calm Thanksgiving, as I'll tell you in a moment. But yeah, I fooled you with the music, Ilva. I know. Hi Angie, how are you? And hello Carol, how are you? So that's just to say hello to those of you who are here already. I'm sure others will be coming soon to check in and say hello, now that I know many of you like to check in with each other online, now that it's become kind of a thing. If you're curious, I was just decided I might as well play a little music while I was fiddling with various things. So what you were listening to there was an excerpt from one of my favorite slightly obscure bands, Thunderclap Newman, which unless you're like into the history of music or you're old, in which case if you're old you probably remember Something in the Air, their hit song, which was gigantic in England. I don't think it was quite such a big deal in America. They were a band formed around Speedy Keen, who was one of the Who's roadies, and who, if you're a Who fan, you've heard Speedy singing on the Who Sell Out, and actually wrote the song he sings on, Armenia, City in the Sky, spelled like Armenia. I never figured that one out. Anyway, that was Speedy Keen and Andy Newman, the piano player, and Jimmy McCullough, who went on to other things with Wings, playing for a long time with Paul McCartney and various other folks. But anyway, one of my favorite bands. That's their only instrumental that I know of. But if you want to check them out sometime, go use your whatever music access you get to go listen to Something in the Air, or Accidents, which is a great favorite of mine because it hits me right in my Gashly Crumb Tiny's bone, funny bone. For those of you who don't know, while I'm flinging references around here, the Gashly Crumb Tiny's is a famous illustrated book by Edward Gorey, and it's an alphabet with basically it's an alphabet of horrible things happening to small children, and it totally kills me. Still does to this day. A is for Albert, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears, etc., etc. It's marvelous, and of course it's Edward Gorey, so the drawings are brilliant. Tragic yet funny. And the song Thunderclap Newman does, Accidents, is basically very, very similar in theme. It's all about these terrible things happening to small children. I'm laughing even as I'm talking about it, and yet I am a parent. I can't help it. That's just my sense of humor. Anyway, good morning, Hazel. How lovely to see you. That's my mother-in-law. Lovely to have you here, even if you can only stop for a little while. Christine, hello. And Petra's at the beach. Well, I'm happy for her, but sad for me. So anyway, say hi to her for me and tell her we all miss her. Anyway, so what's going on here? So we had Thanksgiving on Thursday. It's always the fourth Thursday in November. It's one of those weird non-date oriented holidays. As with many of us, California is having another COVID surge, of course. Things are wretched here. Hello, Mahmoud. Hello. So we didn't, despite the fact that my whole family is here in the Bay Area, and in fact, one of my brothers and his family are a mere few miles away from us here in Santa Cruz. So we didn't get together. We did have a Zoom call where we all got together for a while with my folks and um, both my brothers and their families, and we kicked around the conversational football, and we talked about what we were cooking, and we were all on different schedules. Hello, Enrica, how are you? And But then we had a very nice dinner. We made all the kids, well, almost all the kids of our kids, our young people. They're not really kids anymore. They're all college age. But they made food, and Deb cooked, and I kibitzed, which is one of my specialties. Actually, I usually cook. This is one of the first holidays where I didn't say, "Oh, I'll cook this" or "I'll cook that," because I was in charge of the Zoom meeting technology, which was actually just nothing. But don't tell Deb that, because she thinks I had to work really hard to get us all hooked up. Anyway, but it was very nice. It was lovely to see my family. I miss them a lot. I've always been fortunate in that I have a family that I really enjoy. We don't have political arguments because we're all kind of similar in how we look at the world, and we don't have interfamily arguments because I think we're all pretty satisfied with our lives and what we've done and our families, and you know, our children are all lovely except when they're horrible, so we get along on that stuff. And it was good to see my mom and dad because, as I've mentioned several times, Dad just had a triple bypass, but he looked quite well, very perky, and they didn't stay with us all that long because Dad wanders off. Those of you in Germany who've heard me do some of my talks when I've been doing book tours there will know about my dad, because I've often used him as a subject of conversation because of the Otherland books, and because for so long I kept dedicating Otherland books to him and he didn't know about it. And it became a big thing where people would ask me, "Does your dad know?" And for those of you who haven't heard that story, I'm not going to tell it tonight because it's a long, like a 15-minute story, but one of these times I will tell you because it's pretty funny, and it's also, I love my dad, but he'll drive people crazy, and including his own family. So I'll tell you the story sometime, I promise. So stick with me. That story will be coming. As a matter of fact, one of these days I'm just going to have a story night because there's so many stories I like to share, and here I have this bully pulpit, as it were, of helpless victims, attentive audiences, and there's all these stories to tell. But I've been reading stories, which is also, I guess, and since they've been mostly my stories, I guess that counts too. So anyway, we are reading War of the Flowers. We're reading War of the Flowers. I'm going to continue with War of the Flowers last night. I stretched a little over time last time I was reading, which must have been last Sunday evening instead of Sunday morning, to get to the part where things start to happen. So I will briefly explain to you that Theo, the main character, who has suffered a number of losses in his life and at about age 30 has really kind of gone nowhere fast, sold his mother's house after she passed away. He moved up to the woods, an area that I have lived several times during my life here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and is just trying to figure out what he's going to do next with his life. He's basically left the band, or the band has fired him, or whatever. So he's a musician, and then a cop shows up at his door and wants to ask him some questions because the people who bought his house have been apparently horribly murdered. And although they don't go into any details, it's a pretty nasty situation. At the same time, we know that certain people in a certain place, which, by the way, is Fairyland, the modern version, the current contemporary version of Fairyland, have sent out an IRA, IRRHA, ancient spirit from prehistory, but last heard of in the Mesopotamian civilizations. And it is going in search, and we don't know for certain who it's going in search for in terms of what's in the book, but it's pretty obvious that it's Theo. So Theo has been holed up in his cabin in the woods. He's kind of freaked out. He's been reading the stuff that his great uncle Eamon Dowd wrote about what apparently is Fairyland. And he fell asleep after finishing his great uncle's journal, and woke up to find a small shimmering light in his kitchen and the small shimmering light has proved to be a woman approximately 6 inches or less tall. And that's where we were. So I'm going to reread just a little bit of that last section. Yeah, so I'm going to read the last bit of that and then continue on, since we didn't get to the end of the chapter. He stared at the gleam on the bottom shelf as it wriggled and pulsed, then died. This is the gleam of the little sparkly light in his kitchen at night after he's woken up from a dead sleep. Then, in the moment before the shining spot faded and the room dropped into darkness, he saw something that finally made him lurch up out of his seat. By the time he reached the light switch, he had decided it had to have been a remnant of dream, and that 4 beers had been a few too many. Oh man, what have we learned here? Maybe that depressed people shouldn't drink. But when the light came on, the woman was still sitting on the shelf. She was still 1/2 foot tall. She had wings. "Shite and onions," she said, hugging herself, then dropped lightly down to the countertop beside the sink, translucent wings beating gently to slow her descent. Her feet and legs and arms were bare, the rest of her covered by a red dress that shimmered like butterfly scales. "That damn will hurt." "Oh, Christ," Theo moaned. "What now?" The tiny woman stared at him, frowning. She was terrifyingly solid. Not a blur, not a shadow. She had short carrot-colored hair, a bad color to go with a deep red mini dress, a heretofore unsuspected part of his own mind noted, and a heart-shaped face that was somehow a little too wide across the eyes and cheeks. She looked like the type who would have freckles, but if she did, they were far too small to see. She didn't look happy, although he didn't know why she should be. He wasn't all that happy himself. "This is a dream, isn't it?" he asked hopefully. She bent to rub her knees, then straightened up. He could not get over how small she was. It was sort of like looking at a cute girl at the end of the block, except this one was in perfect focus and only 1.5 yards away. "Well, if it's a dream, then I'm dreaming too, and I'm going to put in a request for a better one next time. Because this one is desperate. Now, are you going to sit there staring like a gobshite, or are you going to offer me a thimble of tea or something? I ache all bloody over from getting here." You're a fairy." "Oh, that's one to you. And you're immortal. So that's sorted. Now, I'm tired, and I'm hurting, and I'm afraid I'm in a bitch of a mood. So how about that tea?" If this was a dream, what did it mean? It's one thing to fantasize about women, but women 1/2 foot high? What does that say about your sense of self-esteem, Vilmos? "Look," she said, and suddenly he could see that, imaginary or not, she was definitely exhausted. "That tea. I'm not shy, I'd get it myself, but I'm not big enough to turn the knobs on your whatchamacallit, your stove. Sorry." He walked toward the countertop, turned on the burner, and put the kettle on it. She still didn't disappear. When the ring began to heat up, she even extended her hands toward it, warming them. "So you really are a fairy," he said at last. I'm not imagining it." "I am. You're not. But why do you talk like you're Irish?" She rolled her eyes and blew a minute strand of hair off her face. "Dick, you are. We don't talk like the Irish. The Irish talk like us, more or less. Get it?" Oh. The unreality of the situation began to seem a little less glaring, but no more explicable. The water boiled. The fairy fluttered her wings and lifted herself back 1/2 foot to get out of the way of the steam. He fumbled 2 tea bags and 2 cups out of the cupboard. "By the trees, fella, I'm not going to drink that much. Just pour me a bit of yours." "Oh, right." He put 1 cup and 1 tea bag away, then set the tea to steeping. He didn't have a thimble, so he retrieved one of the Heineken caps from the pile on the bookshelf. "Is this okay?" She sprang up and hovered beside him, wings beating swift as a hummingbird's. She sniffed the cap. If you'll wash it out. I'm nothing against beer, but I don't want it in my tea. Thank you very much. He sat down with his mug, lost in a roaring internal silence of utter dumbfoundment. The fairy kneeled on the counter, blowing on her cap full of tea to cool it. I'm sorry if I haven't been a very polite host, he began. Don't worry, she said between sips. They often get taken that way. You're kind. It's the glamour I expect. What's your name? She gave him a look that did not seem entirely friendly. What's yours? You don't know? Of course I bloody well know, you great idiot. But you have to tell me first, then I can tell you. Oh, he realized he'd been saying that a lot. I'm Theo Vilmos. Fair play to you. My name is Applecore. Applecore? Don't start. But I just, don't start, fellow. You'll be wearing the rest of this tea. He stared at her, alarmed, but also amused at the thought of being attacked by an angry fairy. Then again, maybe it wasn't funny. Maybe she could turn him into something unpleasant, a toad or a pea under a mattress. At the very least, wouldn't she sour the milk or something? Of course, the milk in my refrigerator is probably sour already, he thought. I didn't mean to offend you, he said out loud. I was only surprised because I don't know anyone with a name like that. She gave him a stern look, then softened somewhat. It's not my fault. I was the last born. What do you mean? We're a big family, the Apples. Got 27 brothers and sisters I have. Seed, skin, pie, pip, doll, tart, tree, wood, bark, blossom, even butter, just to name a few. All the good names are taken by the time I came along. The mistake, man, Dad always called me, but it was in good fun. Yeah, but there was bugger all choice left for names. Ah, it wasn't very clever, but it was better than oh, a little. So what brings you here? Not that you aren't welcome, he added hastily, but we don't get many fairies around here. And with these prices, I'm not surprised. She showed him a weary smile, the first from her he'd seen. Sorry, old joke that. She tilted her little head to look at him carefully. I really don't know. Is it something to do with my great-uncle's book? Not that I've heard. The old fellow sent me didn't tell me much. Apparently he's not the only one interested, but someone's keeping an eye on you. Someone? Someone like who? Shite, man, I don't know. But the old fellow's worried about it, so he sent me to fetch you. Don't ask me, ask him. Old fella? She put down her tea and cocked her head as though listening for something. You said old fella. What old fella? Tansy, his name is. He's a sort of doctor fella from one of the important families. But who is he? Where is he? Applecore shook her head slowly, distracted. Suddenly he thought he knew what she was noticing. A sharp stench, sourly rotten. God, what is that? He asked. A skunk? Something's outside. He stared at her, slow to catch on, but his nervous system knew it before he did. His heart was already going triple speed. Outside? The smell was painfully strong now. His eyes were beginning to water. She was up and hovering, her wings blurred almost to invisibility, making the air hum like the propeller of a toy plane. She shouted something in a high, clear voice, words in a language he did not recognize, then turned to him, clearly frightened, despite the attempt to keep her tiny features hard and expressionless. It'll take a little time to open again. Oh no, we need it so fast. Open? It seemed like he hadn't finished a sentence in hours. Something bumped the front door. 1, 2, 3 times. Theo was so bewildered that he actually reached for the knob. By the trees, she shouted, buzzing up close to his face, fists clenched. Are you completely thick? Don't open that. But there's somebody there. Something shoved the door again, hard enough to make it creak. as though a huge animal had leaned against it. The stink was even more powerful. He reached out and flicked on the outside light, then put his eye to the peephole. He was actually relieved to see the green duffel coat in the glare of the porch bulb, the slouched but obviously human shape huddled against the door. He could see a matted tangle of curly hair, a sheen of dark-skinned scalp and forehead. Some old black guy, he thought, a transient. It's all right, he called to the fairy. It's just... Then the figure's head lolled back. Its jaw was broken, dangling flat against its chest. The blind eyes were not just milky white, but like poached eggs were beginning to collapse and run out of the sockets. Theo staggered away from the door, his heart frightened straight up into his mouth so that for a moment he could not even draw a breath. Applecore buzzed to the peephole, then swam backward in the air. "Bad!" she shrilled. "This is bad!" "What? You don't want to know. Where's that double-cursed door?" He didn't know what she meant. It was pretty obvious. The door was right there, and hell was on the other side of it. But this had to be another nightmare, all of it, however real it seemed. That was the only explanation. He was locked in sleep. Maybe he was even comatose, dying, limp on the cabin floor with his mind showing weird movies like a projector running in an empty theater. There couldn't be anything in the real world like any of this. But if she was part of a dream, Applecore did not know it. She sped around the room like a fly in a bottle, her tiny shape little more than a shadow. "It will get in the easiest way it can. If it has to break in, we may have time. Are there any other doors, man?" She was on about doors again, and Theo couldn't stand it anymore. He sank to a crouch on the floor and clutched his splitting head. The stench was terrible, as though the thing were right in the room with them. "The bathroom," he said, dragging himself upright again. "Oh, Christ, I think the window's open. There's just a screen." He lurched across the room and pulled the bathroom door open. His nostrils were scorched by a blast of ammonia and sulfur. The thing in the duffel coat was pushing at the screen. Even as Theo watched in stunned disbelief, it began to come through, the rotting meat of its hand forced through the netting like hamburger through a grinder. It stopped, impeded by bone. The wormy strands of the fingers writhed and groped a little farther forward, then the screen ripped out of the frame. Theo shrieked and stumbled back into the main room. The bulky shape came through the high bathroom window and fell to the floor with a complicated, wet noise, then dragged itself upright. Theo snatched up his guitar and held it by the neck, trying to keep his legs under him as the stinking thing shambled out into the light. It wasn't even a rotting corpse. Nothing that simple. It stood, swaying, a thing of stinking tatters. Bits of bone and rags and greasy flesh and even curls of newspaper protruded from the torn pants and coat. The left foot was bloody ragged and moldering, but where its right foot should be, two smaller feet seemed to have been smashed together as a makeshift, one of them still wearing a filthy woman's shoe. One of its hands had been mangled by the screen, but was already growing back together. The other arm, raised now beside the collapsed face, did not end in a hand at all, but in the mummified corpse of a cat. Its skeletal jaws opened and closed like clutching fingers as it extended toward him. Theo screamed and swung his Gibson as hard as he could. Part of the thing's mouth and nose flew off, and it staggered, but it did not fall. Air rattled in the hole of its throat. The gaping, crooked jaw twitched, tried to close, but most of the muscles were gone. As the duffel coat gaped open, he saw that a separating hole in its chest had been bandaged over with a shredded mask of flesh, something that had once been a human face. Theo felt himself growing dizzy, saw blackness close in on him. Suddenly, the fairy was there, a winged glimmer between him and the monstrosity. The room grew brighter until it was full of flickering light. He could even see Applecore's face hard as a cameo brooch. "Go on!" she shrilled, and flew at the thing's head like an angry sparrow. It leaned away from her, hissing, and swung its arm. The cat hand clacked, the teeth just failing to close on her. "It's open! The door's open! Go through!" A smoldering glow hung just before the kitchen sink, a seam of dripping light like a zipper in the fabric of reality. He stared at it for a stupefied moment, then flung aside his broken guitar. "Hurry up!" Applecore screamed, but Theo hesitated. Where did it lead? Anywhere would be better than here, now, but... Suddenly he knew. He bent to snatch up his great-uncle's book. "Come on!" he shouted at the fairy. "Don't be daft! The passage is about to close," she cried, although she had little breath to spare. "Just go! I'll keep it busy." For a moment she wheeled up above the thing's head into the full glare of the phantom doorway, or whatever it was, and he saw that the fairy magic she was wielding against the undead beast was Theo's own corkscrew, as big in her arms as a painter's ladder. She spun again and dove, jabbing the sharp point at the thing's ruined face. It flinched back, perhaps out of some forgotten reflex. There was not much there worth saving, but did not seem very alarmed. Theo's heart felt as though it were about to explode out of the top of his head like a Polaris missile. He leaped toward the glowing seam and scrabbled at the opening with his fingers. It tingled strangely, but did not burn. He turned for one last look. A rotting paw just missed grabbing Applecore, but tipped her wing and sent her spinning. She landed on the floor and crouched there for a moment with her head down, clearly stunned. The thing gave a kind of squelchy huff of triumph and staggered toward her. Theo threw himself onto his knees, scooped up the fairy just ahead of the reaching cat jaws, then turned and clambered across the floor toward the door made of light. He fell through, in the most ungraceful way, into nothingness, into a colorless void that crashed like ocean waves and sparkled like stars. Part 2. Last Exit to Fairyland. Chapter 10. Larkspur's Land. He was not simply traveling, he was stretching somehow, as though a part of him were still rooted deep in the reality he had just left, while an increasingly attenuated Theo-ness was being drawn out through thousands of miles of noise and light. All that he was seemed to be getting thinner and more insubstantial, until he felt himself to be a near infinite, near invisible line of consciousness, each mote of thought touching nothing but the single beads of comprehension directly on either side, and all of them pulling farther and farther apart. He was like a rubber band in the hands of God, and God was spreading his mighty arms as wide as they would go, and then the rubber band snapped. When he came back to himself, half his vision was filled with what at first seemed to be a smeary abstract painting of green lines. Grass. He was lying on his side in long grass, and something was moving. He regained his focus in time to see Applecore, who was kneeling a few inches from his nose, bend at the waist and decorously throw up. Despite her appearance and proximity, watching didn't trigger his own reflex, as it might have with another human being. He sat up. That did trigger the reflex. As Theo finished emptying his stomach, spitting over and over into the grass, Applecore took a deep breath and groaned. "Oh, that's worse coming here than going to your side. Glad to hear that." He wiped his chin with the back of his hand. His head was thumping like a timpani solo, and he would have sold his soul without hesitation for a bottle of mouthwash. "Because I don't ever want to feel like that again." He raised his head and looked around. Oh, God. It wasn't so much that anything looked expressly different or wrong. In fact, it all looked very right in a sort of romantic, pre-Raphaelite kind of way. Close standing trees and shadowy grassy dales, beams of midday sunlight diving straight down through the forest roof like glowing plumb lines, sparked with dust and the bright flicker of flying insects. His nausea had faded, but still the colors around him were almost too strong, the edges too crisp. It made his eyes water to look at anything for more than a few moments. It reminded him of the way a dose of psilocybin made the colors of everyday objects leap out like neon. Where are we? Applecore bent again and spat an almost invisible streak of light. Home? Well, home for me. What would you call it? I was never up with all that book learning, shower of shite, and fairy can't translate what you can't say. She frowned and brightened. Of course, fairy. That's what it's called. So, I was right. No, Uncle Eamon was right. Theo stretched his legs out in front of him, listened to the almost subliminal fluting of birds. His headache and nausea had all but disappeared. He could almost forget that he had just been through the weirdest and worst half hour of his life. It's beautiful here. That's why they saved this piece, the little fairy told him. Don't think this is the whole story, boyo. He nodded slowly, although he had no idea what she meant. It was hard to think, almost exhausting. Spending time in the midst of such overwhelmingly powerful scenery was hard on mortal senses. So strange, all so strange. He turned back to Applecore. What the hell was that thing that came after us? The unearthly scenery suddenly felt different, even threatening, especially the shadowy depths behind the closest trees. Will it come here? Is it coming now? Will it come? Likely, Applecore sniffed. Now? Couldn't say, but I doubt they'll find you again so fast. Eventually, though. So was it a good idea to laze around in the woods like a fat gobshite? Likely not. Well, what was it? It took a moment. Hold on, find me? What do you mean, find me? Start walking first. She was up and away, quick as a dragonfly, 20 yards in a couple of seconds, then back just as swiftly to hang in midair before him, a grim little half-smile on her face. Just curious. You standing there with your mouth open? Do you have to do that for a bit before your legs start working? He shut his jaw and let her lead him through the psychedelic forest. I'm not being difficult, she said as they came out of a stand of trees and into an open dell. I just don't know much. I'm a messenger, me. Strictly hired help. All I can tell you is that, just like Tansy sent me after you, someone else must have sent that falling apart thing. Doesn't take much in the brains department to figure that out. You said you'd never seen anyone like me before, not in real life. Ever seen anything like that? God, no. There you are then. It came from one of the in-between places. Must have. If I could find you, then it could too. He shook his head. He was tired of the adventure already. He wanted to lie down and sleep, but instead all he did was put one foot in front of the other, following this irritating little flying woman on and on through what had changed from a magical landscape into a fatiguing nightmare, as though he were being forced to do a survival trek through a Disney film. The sheer visual intensity of the forest, the glittering motes of dust, the bumblebees bright as spun coins, the snaking tangled roots and colorful toadstools in all their profusion. Even the vivid green of the grass was hallucinatory, and it was like getting to be like an acid trip that wouldn't end. It made his head ache. But why me? I'm nobody. I'm boring. Am I arguing? Just save some of the questions for the old fella. He'll probably be able to tell you a good whack more than I can. Tell me about him. You said his name was Tansy? Count Tansy. Yeah. One of the Daisy clan, but a good less stupid than most of your land-owning shower. She pursed her mouth in distaste. Still, I don't owe him nothing, and I wouldn't have done this for him if he weren't paying me, even if he did say it was important. Theo shook his head again. Me? You're talking about me again. Important. Important to someone, yeah, or they wouldn't have sent old Bag of Bones to suck your brains out through your nostrils, would they? Speaking of sending, why did this Tansy send you? Why didn't he come himself? He's used his exemption already, I guess. He's used what? She stopped, hovering, and held a finger to her lips. At first he thought she just wanted him to stop asking so many questions, but then he realized she was listening to something. His skin suddenly seemed to fit poorly, his heart to grow a little too big and violent for his chest. Is it that thing? He whispered. She shook her head, but did not seem very happy. He did his best to stay still so she could hear whatever it was she was straining her tiny ears after. Follow me, she whispered at last. Quick, but as quiet as you can. That means pick up those great clumping feet. She zigzagged away toward the edge of the clearing, and he half ran, half pranced on tiptoe after her, through the wildflower-sprinkled grass. Down there! She pointed to a gully shielded by undergrowth. Theo scrambled down into it, pressed himself into a mat of fallen leaves that glimmered silver and gold and smelled like something that came in expensive bags from a posh gardening store, then cautiously raised his head to look back at the clearing. It was empty. Didn't expect I have to spend my last charm so soon, Applecore muttered. What? Theo began, but Applecore flew up beside him and gave him a surprisingly solid kick on the jaw. Shut it! She hissed. Long seconds crept by. Then what looked like a horizontal flash of sunlight burst from the trees and streaked halfway across the clearing in a heartbeat, then stopped, changing from blur to solid shape so abruptly that he almost gasped in surprise. It was a deer, a huge white buck, with a spreading rack of antlers like two leafless trees carved out of ivory. It stared at the spot where Theo was hidden. The dark liquidity of its gaze seemed to mark him easily, despite his held breath and tight-clenched muscles. Beautiful, beautiful, was all he could think as it stood frozen in an angled stab of sun, like a statue made of burning phosphor. It blinked, then leaped away into the trees on the far side of the clearing, a movement so swift and effortless that Theo could not at first entirely understand what had happened. His mouth worked as he tried to express even a halting appreciation for the vision he had just been given, but Applecore's wings were buzzing beside his ear. She prodded him with her foot, more gently this time. Shh. Her whisper was so close he thought he could even feel the tiny puff of her breath inside his ear. To his surprise, she began to sing. Her voice was scratchy but tuneful. He could not make out the words, but the repetitive melody was oddly compelling, so much so that he did not at first notice that another noise was growing louder, growing all around him, a sound that even at its loudest never became more than a flutter like rain on hard-packed earth. The riders stormed into the clearing. Again he found himself dumbstruck, but it was a less simple awe than that which had pierced him at the sight of the stag. There were close to 24 of the newcomers, male and female, dressed in costumes that seemed to come from completely random times and places, both modern and ancient. Even the colors of the cloth were elusively inconstant, changing like mother of pearl, like sunlight on the water of a moving stream. The riders' faces were fine and proud and strangely ageless. Every one of the hunting party could have been 20 or 40 in human age, or neither. He found it was as hard to look at them as it had been to look at the land around him when he had first come through. His brain searched desperately for measurements, categories, ways to make these creatures into mere humans, but he could not find the mechanism. They confused his familiar ways of judging people, just as surely as the stag had turned him into mud and stone by the mere fact of its lightning swift loveliness. Even their horses were strange, although he could not say what was different about them. They had 4 legs, manes, eyes, flashing teeth, but that did not make them horses, at least not the sort of horses he knew, any more than elaborately curled and arranged hair, jewelry, and quiet conversations made people out of these frighteningly beautiful riders. The hunt party paused in the clearing for only a few moments, riding around the spot where the stag had stopped, staring down raptly as though something were written there that they had never seen before. One of them, a tall man with long golden hair, dressed in something like modern riding gear, if riding clothes were ever made from millions of pearlescent scales, and carrying what appeared to be a rifle with a bright silver barrel and a bone-white stock, stood in his stirrups and pulled his mount around to face the quarter in which the stag had vanished. He spurred out of the clearing and the others followed him, swift as the crack of a whip, but so quiet that by the time the last of them had passed between the nearest trees, Theo could not hear them any more. "That was Lord Larkspur," said Applecore after half a minute of silence. "The one in the lizardy suit. Seen him in the mirror shows. He's better looking in real life, I have to admit, if you like that sort." Theo wasn't sure what sort that was, but he wasn't even too sure of his own name at the moment. "Those were fairies?" Applecore snorted and drifted down to the ground a foot from Theo's face. "Damn few aren't round here, exceptin' you. Flower folk, those were. You might call 'em the local gentry. Oh, they think they're fine, but they were fine." For a moment, Applecore only looked at him, something almost like hurt on her little face. "You've never seen him before, of course," she said at last, then scowled. "Larkspur, right on top of us, and cursed lucky we were not to be noticed. By the trees, I told you not to come back for me." Still overwhelmed, it took him a long moment to make sense of that. "Wait a minute, you mean back at the cabin? Are you saying I should have left you there with that ugly dead thing? I could have made a door for myself. I made that one just for you. I was planning to keep old Ugly busy for a bit. But you dragged me through with you and buggered up the landing, so we've come down in the wrong spot." She shook her head. "Right in the middle of Delphinion. Shite and double shite. Even if we're near the edge of the forest, we're half a day's walk from Daisylands, the rate you waddle, and we don't dare go out from under the trees in daylight." "We can't go out from under the trees because this is Larkspur's land, you thick. It belongs to him, and so does almost everything on it, and a lot above it, including some of the birds. If we come out of the trees, chances are he'll know about it before an hour's passed." "Hey, damn it, quit calling me thick. You may have saved my life, but that doesn't give you a license to kick my ass for the rest of it." "Oh, he's getting snappy. Look, a couple of hours ago I was back in my own world, thinking about nothing more earth-shaking than hopping on my bike and picking up a burrito to go, and suddenly I'm in the middle of storybook land, being led through the enchanted friggin' forest by Thumbelina. And Thumbelina's kind of bitchy just between you and me. Anyway, I'd like to see anyone else do better, so back off." He walked on in silence for a little while. Applecore didn't desert him, or even seem to have taken much offense, so at last he hazarded a question. "What the hell difference does it make whether this guy knows we're on his land or not?" "'Cause Larkspur's a chokeweed, see? It would be one thing if he were a creeper, or even a middle-of-the-road fella, like Tansy, but I'm guessing every one of them chokeweeds would be just as happy to slit your throat as look at you." Theo was completely baffled. "Larkspur? Chokeweed? Aren't those plants?" Applecore gave out a quite expressive noise of disgust. Well, I suppose it's not your fault you don't know anything. Keep walking, and I'll try to tell you a wee bit about things. But pay attention. Even if you do think I've been giving you too much stick, and maybe I have, but then again, maybe it's what you need. If I tell you to shut up, stop where you are and shut right up. This world is dangerous for you, boyo, and not just because the way you walk, you're liable to trip over a branch and break your nose. Dangerous? Got it? He nodded. Right then, she said, rising into the warm afternoon air. Get those feet moving. It would have been hard to absorb so many details of fairy history and culture if he had been sitting in a quiet classroom, listening to a professor, or reading it in a textbook. Hearing it from Applecore, while staggering through the bizarre and distracting forest landscape, was a bit like trying to take a complex course in political science from an immigrant taxi driver during the first half hour in a new city. And his instructor's style was not the most helpful either. Every time he felt he was beginning to see the light, Applecore would suddenly decide to fly ahead and scout the terrain, or would buzz up in front of his face to comment adversely on his pace or attention. What he did manage to grasp went something like this. Fairies here came in all shapes and sizes, but the most powerful caste, the nobility in a sense, or at least the upper class, seemed to favor roughly human shape and size, like the hunting party he had just seen. Like humans of a similar social position, they generally maintained residences in both the country and the city. There seemed to be only one big city, as far as he could tell, apparently the same strange metropolis as described in his great-uncle's book. The noble houses were all named after flowers, and these clans seemed to wield most of the control in Fairy. They own the powerhouses, don't they? Was Applecore's slightly cryptic explanation of why that should be. The flower clans moved through a shifting and bewildering set of political alliances and conflicts, but the one that seemed most important for Theo to understand was the struggle between the creepers and the chokeweeds, since the subject of dispute was mortals. Applecore did not have a firm grasp on the entire history of the conflict, but as best Theo could make out, the creepers believed in coexistence with human beings, but the chokeweeds were opposed. Opposed? He asked. What does that mean? I suppose it means they want to kill them. Kill them? A chill ran through him. Sweet Jesus, how many mortals have you got around here anyway? She wrinkled her little brow for a moment, thinking. None that I know of these days. Except you. He swallowed. It wasn't easy. But why would there be such a big deal made about killing mortals if there aren't any here? 'Cause it isn't just the ones here they're talking about killing, you thick. It didn't sink in for a moment or two, but when it did, he stopped walking. Hang on! Damn it, stop flying! Are you telling me there's a bunch of fairies who want to kill all the people in the world? The people where I live? Real people? Applecore scowled. What does that mean? Real? Haven't I real you? If you cut me, do I not bleed? If you piss me off, will I not kick you up the arse? I'm not trying to offend you. I'm trying to make sense out of this. What exactly does that mean? They want to kill mortals. She shrugged, still angry. Like I said, it's a big political thing. If you want to know more, ask your man Tansy. I'm just the laboring class. Jesus. He started walking again. The magical forest was beginning to seem even less attractive. How many of these chokeweeds are there? Not that many. Maybe a quarter of the flowers, tops. A quarter? Jesus Christ! Would you quit saying that? Applecore buzzed around his head 3 times. It doesn't do me any damage personally, but there's plenty ears don't like it. Not to mention that if we meet up with a stranger, you'll give yourself away. Throwing that name around sure as winter brings frost. Wouldn't go shouting Muhammad or Buddha either now. You come to it. What? Are you telling me the other fairies wouldn't notice I didn't belong here if I just kept my mouth shut? Yeah, you'd be surprised. She smirked. There's some stupid fairies, but. Now, far as the chokeweeds go, you got to remember there's at least that many creepers. And they like your sort well enough. The question is how many of the in-betweeners gets pulled one way or the other. Don't worry so much, boyo. It's all been going on for a long, long time. She paused, hovering. Hang on a bit. I hear something. I hear something strange. She raised her head, tilted it. Smell something, too. What do you think? Just stand here and do nothing, will you? But by the trees, I'm ready to start reading chokeweed pamphlets myself after putting up with you, and I don't even have a vote. Now just shut it and wait for me. And she swung wide around him and then shot off like a bullet, a blur of red dress disappearing among the trees. Theo sank to the grassy ground, then put his head in his hands to rest his eyes. It was all just bizarre past any grasping. A few hours ago, he had been living a normal life in his normal cabin in the mountains of normal Northern California. Not a great life, maybe. In fact, lately, a pretty pathetic loser sort of life. But one almost completely empty of shambling corpse-limbed monstrosities and smart-ass fairies. How did Uncle Eamon deal with this shit without going crazy? Of course, his great-uncle had gone looking for it. It had been his life's dream. Reminded, he pulled the notebook out of the pocket of the leather jacket, which was tied around his waist. The book had been bumping against his legs so long as he walked that he had actually considered pulling it out and throwing it away just to keep from going mad. Theo was not a great hiker, he was the first to admit, but it was pretty much his only connection to anything resembling the world he knew. But I read almost all of it, he thought. I sort of remember some of the families being named after flowers, but why don't I remember anything about this chokers and creeps stuff? He began to leaf through the pages as he waited for Applecore to return, wondering what else he might have missed that could save him from being eaten by big bad wolves or some other god-awful thing. It was just so hard to believe that he was actually here, that everything in the book had been true. Applecore buzzed back into view. Trouble? She said. We're right at the edge of one of Larkspur's farms. We could go round it, but it'd take us days longer. Days longer? To get to Tansies. Larkspur won't be anywhere near the farm holding. Too busy chasing that corpsey hart. But if one of his factors gets wind of you, his lordship will come quick enough. Theo shrugged. So what are we supposed to do? You can fly, but I sure as hell can't. She stared at him for a moment, perhaps about to say something rude, but instead she brightened and pointed a finger at him. Disguise, boyo. That's how we'll save your mortal hide. He waggled his arm. A shower of twigs fell out of the sleeve of his leather jacket. What am I supposed to be, a scarecrow? Quit messing about with the branches. They're supposed to stick out. Same with the leaves in your hair. No, you're not a scarecrow. You're a woodwight. A leshy, some call him. Bit big, but if you hunch over. You mean I have to walk with this jacket on? I'll get heat stroke. You'll get worse than that if Larkspur and his mates get hold of you. Put you in the wicker man. Roast you like a high Brazil potato, they will. Now quit squirming till I put this mud on your face. Mud? What the hell? So you'll look like the little old thing that lives in the woods and hardly ever comes out in the daytime. She buzzed backward a foot or so and hovered, surveying her handiwork. A few more leaves in your hair would have helped. Ah, well, keep the collar of that jacket up. Now follow me. No, I told you walk slow, like you got crookedy legs. It's hard to remember. Tell you what, boyo, I'm trying to save your life, and you're not helping. Maybe I should take one of these sticks and lodge it up your back passage. That'd make you walk slow enough. You know, on a per-inch basis, you may be the most unpleasant person I've ever met. He followed her out through the thinning forest fringe. The mud on his face was itching already, but not half so badly as the twigs and dried leaves in his jacket and trouser legs. Theo did his best to keep up the shambling, arm-swinging walk Applecore had shown him, something like a chimpanzee with a broken neck, but it was hard to feel very confident about imitating something he'd never seen. Are there a lot of these slushies around here? He saw flat green gold land past the trees now. The thing I'm supposed to be? Hardly any, she said. Unless don't come out of the forest much anyway. Maybe one day a year. What? He pulled up short, rubbing at his face in irritation. Then how is this going to fool anyone? Applecore flew so close to his ear that he winced at the pressure change. I didn't say it would fool anyone, she hissed. I said we had to hope it might, because first off, it's the only thing around here bugging stupid enough for you to pass yourself off as. And second, on that single day when one of them woodwhite fellows does come out of the forest, he walks around honking and whistling and acting mad as an old stick. Don't ask me why, because I don't spend much time in the leshy taverns. But when they got their spring fever on them, nobody goes much near them. So if people think you're one, chances are they'll leave you alone. But just in case anyone does come looking to pass the time of day, I advise you to start squealing and honking and whatnot. Real grumpy like. Got it? Because I'd say it beats the jabbers out of being roasted like an old spud. Properly chastened, Theo fell back into his shuffling, uncomfortable walk. The great ocean of trees through which they had been traveling had thinned now to a few small copses dotted along the hillside. As they made their way from one cluster of trees to another, Theo saw that they were descending into a disconcertingly wide plain. It was hemmed on either side by rows of green hills, lush as something in the background of a Maxfield Parrish painting. But those were far away. The nearest at least a couple of hours' walk, Theo decided, and probably more. At the base of the hill they were descending, the land had been leveled and plowed, the soil dark as ground coffee, but mostly obscured by a sea of waving, shimmering fronds. Here and there, figures moved among the stalks, bending and straightening. What is all that? Wait, bend over more, you're starting to look human. He crouched, conscious of a nagging pain starting in his back. But it looks like gold, like real gold. You don't think we make fairy bread out of the same stuff you mortal fellows grow, do you? Keep walking. Even as they descended the hillside, Applecore led him in a wide swing to one side so they could cross the broad field closer to its edge. After a few minutes, she lit on his shoulder. If they see me flying around, they'll wonder why a sprite's keeping company with a leshy, she explained, and nestled in among the twigs and leaves, but continued to issue instructions from her new perch. Root and bow, man. Can't you remember to gibber a bit? Wave those arms around. Theo did not want to die in a wicker man, or by any other quaint methods the locals might have devised. He did his best to make appropriate noises and movements. He could see that some of the nearer farm workers had stopped to watch him over the tops of the rows, but was relieved to see that none of them seemed inclined to do anything but look. He stumbled along, gratefully aware that the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. He had never thought of fairyland as a place where you could get a sunburn, although he supposed the mud and twigs would protect him from that. But it was certainly warm enough to make the leaves down his neck itch like sin and the hot leather jacket feel like a very cruel punishment. There was a tiny bit of solace in the smell of the wheat itself, a rich, heady aroma like freshly unkegged beer, as though there was drunkenness in the grain of fairy even before any distilling took place. As he reached the edge of the field and stepped between two rows of golden stalks, a trio of heads popped up only a couple of rows away. Theo let out a gasp of surprise and stopped. As astonishingly small as she was, Applecore still looked quite human, and the fairy gentry he had seen earlier could also have passed for human at a distance, but the three faces staring at him were not so easy to mistake. All three had huge eyes, faces as wrinkled as a 1,000-year-old mummy, and instead of noses, just two round nostrils opening straight into their faces. Something sharp jabbed his earlobe. "Make some noise, you idiot," Applecore whispered. Theo began to wave his arms and moan. The strange faces regarded him expressionlessly for a moment. He lunged into the wheat as though heading toward them, and they vanished down behind the row. "What the hell were those?" he asked when he could hear them rattling away in the other direction. Dobbies, said Applecore. Not too bright, those lads, but they'll not come back. Ugly, Theo shivered. Applecore laughed sharply. Ah, if you find those a bit homely, I'd hate to be in your shoes when you meet a Kilmolus, or one of them Fashan, or old Peg Powler herself. Don't want to meet any of them, Theo said wearily. Want to go home. Applecore frowned. Yes, well, and that's where we're going to stop on yes, well. So, at this point, since we are quite close to 3 o'clock, I am going to wrap it up for the night. I will continue from this point when I return to my desk at 7 p.m. tonight. Oh, in case you're wondering which shirt I'm wearing tonight, I'm wearing my Jimi Hendrix shirt, one of my Jimi Hendrix shirts. As I think I explained once, everybody in my family knows you can either buy me a book or a t-shirt for any holiday, any birthday, anything. And all my kids know is that I'm extremely old. So they always get me t-shirts from like the 60s. So I have, not that I don't love all those groups and bands and musicians and stuff. I am a huge Hendrix fan. I am a Beatles fan. I am a fan of The Who and others, and Stones and all that stuff. But I'm also, I like contemporary music too. But of course, my kids can't imagine that I might actually listen to anybody who's actually around now. So most of my musical T-shirts are people from the 60s or early 70s. If I'm extremely, if they really go lunging to one side, I might get something from the 70s. But anything later than that, they're like, it's too late for Dad. Dad stopped listening to music back in 1969, I think they think, or something. Of course, I would have been really young. Anyway, so I'm bibble-babbling just a tiny bit now because it is rather late, and it has been a bit of a long weekend. But I will be back tomorrow later today at 7 p.m. to read some more of War of the Flowers. Until that point, please continue doing what you're doing, which is being kind and careful and taking care of yourself and your loved ones and your neighbors and friends and your community. And we will get through all this crap somehow. And we will come out the other side shiny and bright. Well, I don't know how shiny and bright we'll be, but we'll come out the other side. So I want to thank you so much, as always, for joining me and giving me and my sad existence a little reason to continue. No, I don't mean to make that sound self-pitying or depressed or anything. Sorry, that I'm not that way. I'm a happy guy, and I'm a lucky guy, and I'm enjoying everything, even being stuck inside. It's just everybody else is like me now. This is what happens. Same thing happened when I used to be a flying phobic about airplanes. I'm not anymore, but that's a long story and has mostly to do with prescription chemicals. But I used to be a flying phobic. And after 9/11, people would say like, oh my God, you were already so afraid to fly. This must be horrible for you, because of course everybody was totally paranoid. And I would say to them, actually, no, I'm still just the same way I was. It's just everybody else is worrying about the same kind of stuff that I used to be worrying about, watching everything like, oh my God. And the same is kind of true to an extent with the pandemic. I spent most of my adult life in kind of hermetically sealed at home most of the time working and only occasionally going out to do anything else. So I don't feel the difference quite as much as some people do. For those of you who do feel the difference strongly, you have my sympathies. I'm not trying to make it sound like, ha. It's terribly tough, especially for people who are having to do lockdown and do social distancing, and they don't live with a butt ton of other human beings and animals like I do. I'm sure it can be very difficult. So you have my sympathies, and that's one reason why it's important to reach out to other people at times like this, especially the elderly or the people who are living alone. Anybody that if you can even just phone them up and say, hey, how you doing? It's always helpful. Anyway, with that, I am going to wrap it up for the night. So again, pleasure to see you and to be with you virtually. 7 p.m. tonight, I will be reading again. And until that point, ooh, maybe we should even do some outro music here. Until that point, you guys all stay good and be well. And I will see you very soon. Let's see if we get the same page back. Yum bum bum. I'm trying to sign off, but it's taking forever to open. God, I hate this thing. This is really a waste of time and energy here because, of course, you're all sitting there going, what the heck is wrong with him? And meanwhile, I'm stretching this all out here. But, anyway, so that's that. And I say goodnight, and I say thank you, and I will see you very soon. Okay? Okay. Oh, man. I can't make this work to save my life.